Every visitor who lands in Cairo hears the same version of events within minutes of arriving. A pharaoh named Khufu wanted an eternal monument. He commanded tens of thousands of laborers, handed them copper tools and timber sleds, and over roughly 2 decades they hauled more than 2 million blocks of limestone and granite into the most precise structure ever raised by human hands. It is a clean story. It fits on a museum placard. It photographs well on a postcard. And for nearly 2 centuries, almost nobody with a serious reputation to protect has dared to stand in front of it and say out loud that the arithmetic doesn't work. One man has spent 30 years doing exactly that. He has no university post, no excavation permit, no letters after his name that say Egyptologist. And that absence of credentials is precisely why the professional guardians of the pyramid story dismiss him so easily, and precisely why millions of ordinary people keep listening to him anyway. His name is Graham Hancock, and the claim he has built his entire career on is simple to state and enormous in its implications. The story we were taught about who built the Great Pyramid does not survive contact with the evidence sitting inside it. And there is one detail, more than any other, that he keeps coming back to. The most famous building on the planet, supposedly the personal tomb of one of the most powerful rulers in human history, contains not a single carved inscription bearing that ruler's name anywhere within its chambers. Not one. Once you sit with that fact, the rest of the official story starts to wobble. To understand why so many people take Hancock seriously despite the wall of academic hostility aimed at him, it helps to understand where he came from, because his path into this subject was not the one you would expect. He did not begin as a fringe theorist chasing ancient mysteries for their own sake. He spent years as a working journalist, writing on economics, politics, and international affairs for serious publications that demanded rigor and evidence before anything went to print. That training instills a particular habit of mind. Distrust the official version until it has earned your belief, follow inconsistencies wherever they lead, and never assume a story is true simply because everyone in the room agrees to repeat it. Sometime in the early 90s, Hancock turned that same instinct away from newsrooms and toward ruins. He never really turned it off again. Over the following decades he traveled to nearly every place on Earth where ancient stone refuses to behave the way textbooks say it should. He walked the plateau at Giza more times than he can probably count. He examined the flooded temple complexes off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, where divers argue endlessly about whether the underwater terraces are natural rock formations shaped by erosion or deliberately cut architecture submerged by rising seas. He climbed the terraced hillsides of Indonesia at a site called Gunung Padang, where some researchers claim carbon dating points to construction phases far older than anything conventional archaeology allows for organized human building projects. He stood before the pyramids of Mesoamerica and asked why cultures separated by oceans, with supposedly no contact between them, kept arriving at the same architectural solution to the same problem. Across all of it, he reads geology alongside mythology, astronomy alongside oral tradition, treating flood legends and creation myths not as charming superstition but as possible folk memory of real, catastrophic events. The pattern he believes he sees connecting all of this is not one that mainstream archaeology wants to entertain, and the field has made its objections loud and public. The formal response from Egyptology has rarely been gentle. His work gets labeled pseudoscience in academic reviews and public debates alike. Critics argue that he starts with his conclusion already fixed and then goes hunting backward for evidence that seems to support it, discarding whatever contradicts him along the way. Some accuse him of something worse than sloppy method. They say his theories, whether he intends it or not, quietly strip credit from the real ancient civilizations who accomplished extraordinary things without help from any lost predecessor culture. His defenders see the opposite. They see an outsider willing to ask the uncomfortable question that a professional Egyptologist cannot afford to ask without risking tenure, funding, and reputation. To them he is less a fringe theorist and more an inconvenient whistleblower standing at the gates of an institution that has too much invested in its founding story to ever seriously re-examine it. Whichever side earns your sympathy, one fact remains constant. Hancock has spent 3 decades staring at these monuments longer and harder than almost anyone alive, and the longer he looks, the less the textbook explanation satisfies him. So begin where he begins. inside the silence. Picture yourself walking into the Great Pyramid, past the narrow entrance passage that forces even an average-sized adult to stoop, up through the soaring corbelled ceiling of the Grand Gallery that no engineer has ever fully explained the necessity of, until you arrive at the king's chamber. Now recall what you already know about the ancient Egyptians as a civilization. They were relentless, obsessive decorators of anything meant to matter. Tomb walls, temple ceilings, coffin lids, the undersides of sarcophagus lids, the backs of statues nobody was ever meant to see. All of it covered in hieroglyphs, painted scenes of gods and the afterlife, prayers, spells, and the names of the dead repeated over and over, because in their theology, a name spoken or written was believed to keep a soul alive beyond death. Writing a name was not decoration to them. It was survival magic. And yet the king's chamber, the supposed eternal resting place of one of history's wealthiest and most powerful monarchs, is bare. No hieroglyphs on the walls. No painted scenes of a pharaoh's soul sailing into the underworld. No funerary texts. No spells from the kind of mortuary literature found in nearly every other royal burial of the era. Bare granite, floor to ceiling. In the center sits a plain rectangular box of red granite that archaeologists call a sarcophagus, though it is worth noting it has no lid, no carvings, no inscriptions of any kind on its surface. When it was first opened in the modern era, there was no mummy inside it, no royal seal, no jewelry, no canopic jars holding preserved organs, which every pharaonic burial of any real status included. No grave goods whatsoever. Nothing that separates it from an empty stone container sitting in an empty stone room. For a culture incapable of leaving a blank surface alone, that silence is not just unusual. Hancock argues it is close to a confession. It doesn't read like the absence of decoration. It reads like the absence of an actual burial. Which brings us to the obvious, almost forbidden question Hancock insists on asking anyway. How do we actually know Khufu built this thing? If the chamber offers no name, no funerary evidence, no direct physical link between the pharaoh and the structure, where does the entire attribution come from? Trace that question back far enough, all the way to its single point of origin, and you land somewhere far shakier than any museum placard would have you believe. The entire chain of ownership rests on a handful of crude marks, scrawled in red ochre paint, discovered under deeply suspicious circumstances by a man who had every personal incentive imaginable to find precisely what he found. The year was 1837. A British Army officer and adventurer named Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse was running out of both time and money in Egypt. He had traveled there hoping to make the kind of discovery that would cement his name permanently alongside history's great explorers. But his funding was nearly exhausted. His patience with the plateau's stubborn secrets was wearing thin, and he had, to that point, found nothing that justified the money and months he had already spent. Vyse was not a careful academic excavator working with brushes and notebooks. He worked with gunpowder, and he used it liberally. Above the king's chamber, buried within the mass of the pyramid itself, sit a series of low, cramped relieving chambers stacked directly on top of one another, spaces so shallow that no person could ever stand upright inside them. One had been known for years. Vyse became convinced there were more sealed above it, chambers untouched since construction. So he blasted his way upward through solid limestone, forcing a passage with explosives where none had existed, cracking open cavity after cavity that had not felt open air in millennia. And in the gloom of one of those newly opened spaces, painted directly onto the stone in red ochre, he found what he had been searching for. Quarry marks. The kind of shorthand notations laborers left behind to track crews, directions, and shipments. And among those marks, a royal cartouche, the oval ring the Egyptians used to enclose a king's throne name. The reading that would go on to become the unshakable foundation of pyramid attribution rendered that name as Khufu. Sit with what that actually means for a moment, because it is easy to lose sight of underneath a century and a half of confident repetition. Every textbook, every documentary, every tour guide standing at the base of the pyramid telling visitors with total certainty who built it. All of that confidence traces back to a few strokes of paint found inside a sealed chamber by a desperate, financially ruined colonel wielding dynamite in 1837. There is no independent corroborating evidence. No second discovery. No inscription anywhere else in or around the pyramid naming Khufu as its builder. Remove those marks, and the entire chain linking pharaoh to monument simply disappears. So Hancock does what any competent investigator would do when handed a single, uncorroborated piece of evidence recovered under murky conditions. He asks who found it, and notes it was a man whose career badly needed a discovery. He asks when it was found, and notes it arrived at the precise moment that career was collapsing. He asks whether independent, disinterested witnesses were present to verify the marks at the moment they were uncovered, and finds that the historical record on this point is thin, contested, and far from the rigorous documentation a modern excavation would require. There was Weiss, his hired workers, and a freshly blasted chamber deep inside a mountain of stone he alone controlled access to. Then there are the marks themselves. Hancock is far from the only researcher who has raised questions about them. Skeptics point to details in the hieroglyphic style that strike some epigraphers as inconsistent with the period the marks are supposed to date from. Orthographic quirks, oddly positioned symbols, paint that in some places appears to run in ways inconsistent with genuine ancient application. Mainstream Egyptologists generally treat these as unremarkable anomalies, the ordinary messiness you would expect from ancient laborers working quickly in poor light. Hancock treats them as exactly the kind of small, telling inconsistencies you might expect if a 19th-century man working by lamplight with a bucket of ochre had tried, and not quite succeeded, at faking the handwriting of a civilization he did not fully understand. He is careful, more careful than his loudest critics generally acknowledge, never to claim he has proven forgery outright. What he claims is narrower and, in its own way, more unsettling, that the single most important piece of physical evidence assigning ownership of the greatest monument on the planet to one specific human being is exactly the kind of evidence that any serious investigation would treat with enormous suspicion, and that instead it received nearly 2 centuries of unquestioning acceptance because it told the world precisely what the world already wanted to hear. But suppose, for the sake of argument, the marks are entirely genuine. Suppose Khufu's name really was painted in those hidden chambers by workers loyal to him. Hancock's next move is to ask whether that actually proves what everyone assumes it proves. A name inside a structure demonstrates presence. It demonstrates involvement. It does not, by itself, demonstrate authorship. There is an enormous difference between raising something from nothing and inheriting something already standing, repairing it, resealing its chambers, restoring what time had damaged, and leaving your mark on the work the way conquerors throughout history have claimed credit for monuments built long before they were born. Which leads to the reframing Hancock is best known for and most criticized over. What if Khufu did not build the Great Pyramid at all, but inherited it? It is an uncomfortable idea precisely because it dismantles the tidy chronology printed in every textbook, the clean arrow running from primitive tools to finished masterpiece within a single generation. But Hancock points out that the discomfort belongs to us, not to the ancient Egyptians themselves. Later pharaohs across Egyptian history were prolific recyclers of earlier monuments. It was common practice to chisel a new royal name over an older cartouche, to claim temples, obelisks, and statues built by rulers who had died centuries earlier. In their worldview, this was not fraud, it was continuity. A ruler standing before a monument that already felt impossibly ancient was not lying by claiming it. He was absorbing its power into his own legitimacy, folding an older glory into his own reign. Given how routine that practice was across the civilization, Hancock asks why we should assume the single greatest structure in Egyptian history is the one exception to a habit practiced almost everywhere else. Look at the Giza Plateau with that possibility in mind, and something genuinely odd comes into focus. The Great Pyramid does not sit comfortably alongside the pyramids we can more confidently date and attribute. Those other Old Kingdom pyramids, the ones riddled with structural mistakes, built from rubble cores faced with thin limestone casing, covered in the funerary inscriptions the Great Pyramid conspicuously lacks, have not aged well. Many have slumped, lost their outer casing, and collapsed into shapeless mounds that from a distance look more like natural hills than deliberate architecture. They read like the work of a civilization learning through trial and error, refining its methods generation by generation, occasionally failing badly along the way. The Great Pyramid does not belong to that learning curve. It does not sit at the polished end of a long sequence of experimentation. It appears, in the accepted timeline, almost fully formed, the most precise, most massive, most mathematically sophisticated structure of the entire ancient world, dropped into the middle of a construction sequence that otherwise reads like a series of educated guesses. Civilizations tend not to leap that way. They stumble forward, building on the failures of the previous generation. When a masterpiece sits surrounded by comparatively crude apprentice work, the simplest explanation is not always that the same builders produced both. Sometimes the simplest explanation is that the masterpiece was already there before the apprentices arrived. None of this reframing would carry much force on its own. Arguments about who painted what inside a sealed chamber 2 centuries ago will always remain, to some degree, a matter of interpretation. Hancock understands this, and it is why the core of his case does not actually rest on the paint at all. It rests on the stone itself, 13 acres of hard physical evidence sitting in open daylight, available to anyone with a level, a compass, and the patience to actually measure it. And once you start measuring, he argues, the accepted numbers stop adding up. Start with the orientation of the entire structure. The Great Pyramid is aligned not to magnetic north, which drifts over centuries and is comparatively easy to estimate crudely, but to true north, the fixed geographic pole around which the entire visible sky appears to rotate. And it is not aligned approximately. Surveys place the error margin at roughly 1/20th of a single degree, an accuracy so fine that modern surveying teams equipped with laser instruments and satellite positioning still find it genuinely difficult to beat on that same plateau today. The accepted story asks us to believe that a Bronze Age workforce using copper tools, wooden sleds, and rope, without a magnetic compass, without a telescope, without any instrument we would consider remotely essential to the task, achieved that alignment not on a small marker stone but across the entire 13-acre footprint of a monument weighing close to 6 million tons. The foundation beneath that monument raises the same question. Across the full 13-acre base, the leveling of the underlying rock varies by only a small fraction of an inch from corner to corner. Modern construction crews pouring concrete slabs with laser levels and hydraulic screeds do not always achieve that degree of flatness across a comparable area, and this leveling was carried out directly on living bedrock, by hand, before a single block of the pyramid itself was ever set in place. Hancock's argument is not that achieving this is physically impossible for human beings under any circumstances. It is that the gap between the tools we are told were used and the precision we can independently measure today is not a minor discrepancy explainable by unusually skilled laborers. It is a chasm, and the conventional account tends to walk past it without acknowledging it exists at all. Then there is the fit of the stones themselves. Walk the interior passages and run a hand along the joints between the enormous blocks, some weighing 2, 5, 10, even 15 tons apiece, and in place after place you cannot slide a thin card, let alone a blade, into the seam between them. In several locations the joints are not even flat, they curve and angle along shaped surfaces, interlocking the way modern structural engineers design joints specifically to distribute stress and absorb movement rather than fracture under it. That is not the byproduct of enthusiastic pounding with a copper chisel. That looks like intention, an understanding of load and force applied at a scale that seems wildly out of proportion to the toolkit history has handed the builders. Run the arithmetic against the accepted timeline and the picture gets harder still to defend. The pyramid contains somewhere in the range of 2 million individual blocks. The conventional chronology allows roughly 20 years for construction. Divide one figure by the other, accounting honestly for rest days, flood seasons, and the physical limits of human laborers working without modern lifting equipment, and you arrive at a construction pace of one precisely fitted block, quarried, transported, and set in place, every few minutes, for 2 straight decades, without an error significant enough to visibly distort the finished shape. That is the number Hancock returns to again and again, not because it is impossible to imagine any workforce achieving it, but because no one defending the conventional story has ever offered a workable, physically demonstrated method by which it could actually happen at that pace with the tools the timeline insists were available. The granite compounds the problem rather than easing it. The King's Chamber is not built from the soft local limestone quarried a short distance away. Its walls and ceiling beams are red granite, some individual ceiling blocks weighing as much as 80 tons, roughly the mass of a diesel locomotive. That granite was not local. It came from quarries near Aswan, more than 500 miles south along the Nile. The accepted account requires that workers cut 80-ton blocks from some of the hardest stone found in Egypt using tools too soft to easily scratch it, transport those blocks downriver, drag them inland, raise them more than 150 feet into the structure, and set them into place with the same razor-fine precision found everywhere else in the building, all using little more than rope, timber, and coordinated human muscle. This is exactly where the leading conventional explanation, the Great External Ramp Theory, runs into its most serious problem. Engineers who have actually modeled the physics point out that a ramp shallow enough to drag multi-ton loads up to that height would need to stretch for the better part of a mile and would require more raw material to build than the pyramid itself contains. In effect, the theory asks us to accept that the builders constructed a second, even larger earthen monument purely as scaffolding for the first, then dismantled it so completely afterward that not one clear physical trace of it has ever been located on the plateau. Alternative theories involving internal ramps, elaborate pulley systems, or staged levering each solve one narrow piece of the puzzle while leaving the rest hanging, and none of them has produced the kind of unambiguous physical fingerprint in the archaeological record that you would expect from a construction method used continuously for 2 decades. This is the turn in Hancock's argument that his critics find hardest to sit with, precisely because it is more measured than they want it to be. He is not arguing for extraterrestrial visitors or supernatural intervention. He is arguing something narrower and, in its own way, more disquieting, that the tools we are told were used do not match the precision we can measure, that the timeline we are handed does not survive contact with the arithmetic, and that the explanations offered for how it was actually accomplished do not match the physical evidence left on the ground. 4 independent lines of evidence: the alignment, the leveling, the joint work, and the granite. And each one points away from the tidy story most of us absorbed without question as children. Hancock is careful to frame this not as proof of some specific alternative narrative, but as grounds for a much simpler kind of humility, an acknowledgement that whoever accomplished this understood something about stone, mass, and precision that our conventional account of their capabilities does not adequately explain. None of this settles the debate, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Mainstream Egyptologists have offered responses to nearly every point raised here: proposed ramp configurations, estimates of achievable ancient surveying accuracy, experimental archaeology projects that have moved large stones with surprisingly modest resources, and detailed rebuttals of the claims made about the 1837 discovery. Serious scholars on both sides of this argument are not uniformly credentialed on one side and uncredentialed on the other, and reasonable, well-informed people continue to disagree sharply about how much weight the anomalies Hancock highlights should actually carry. What Hancock has consistently managed to do, whatever you conclude about his larger theories, is force the conversation back to a set of measurable, physical facts that a great many casual visitors to Giza have simply never been told to look at closely. So look at those 4 numbers again: the alignment accurate to a fraction of a degree, the foundation level to a fraction of an inch across 13 acres, joints too tight to slip a blade into, and a construction pace of 1 finished block every few minutes for 20 straight years. Which of those strikes you as hardest to reconcile with copper tools and a 2-decade deadline? And more importantly, ask yourself honestly whether the version of this story you grew up with ever mentioned any of it at all, or whether you were only ever handed the ending, with all of the inconvenient arithmetic quietly left out.